So, South Park, a show about four small boys in a fictional mountain town in Colorado, a place where it snows every day, where the adults are almost always more dangerous and more delusional than the children, and where nothing, not religion, not race, not the sitting president of the United States, not your most cherished childhood memories, not your deeply held convictions about history or justice or human decency, is treated as too sacred to become the raw material for a joke. Since August 13th, 1997, Trey Parker and Matt Stone have been building episodes in an almost impossibly compressed 6-day production window, writing them, voice acting them, animating them, and sending them to Comedy Central like small, carefully constructed time bombs designed to go off in the middle of whatever the country happened to be most anxious about that particular week. And for 28 seasons and more than 338 episodes, the show has returned again and again, sometimes with grace and sometimes with brute force, to one of the most complicated, most contested, most unavoidable subjects in American life. Race, not cautiously, not with hedged language and careful qualifications. Not with the kind of deliberate sanitization that most American television applies to conversations about ethnicity, heritage, prejudice, and the long, bloody, unresolved history that sits underneath all of them. But right into the center of it, with a foul-mouthed 9-year-old named Cartman and a construction paper aesthetic that somehow makes everything simultaneously funnier and more unsettling than it has any right to be. Tonight we are going to sit with all of that together. We are going to move slowly through the episodes, through the characters, through the specific moments that generated the most debate and the most damage and the most surprising clarity. We are going to look at the reactions from audiences, from scholars, from civil rights organizations, from foreign governments, from the show's own creators in interviews and commentary tracks across 3 decades. We are going to follow the thread from Cartman's very first anti-Semitic jab at Kyle Broflovsky all the way through to the moment in 2022 when the show effectively rewrote its own history with a single episode about a character whose name turned out never to have been what any of us thought it was. We will spend real time with each major thread of racial humor that the show has woven through itself, and we will keep returning to the question that the show itself keeps asking and never quite fully answering. What is it actually doing with all of this? Is it helping? Is it hurting? Does the equal opportunity philosophy hold up when you examine it carefully? Does any of that even matter when the joke lands? The lights are low. There is nowhere you need to be. We are going to go slowly through this together. Let all of it settle over you like the kind of soft, persistent Colorado snow that falls on South Park in every single episode, no matter what season it is supposed to be. Before we go any further, if you are listening to this right now, I want you to drop a comment below and tell me what time it is and where you are watching from. It can be a sentence, 3 in the morning in Sydney, midnight in Chicago, 11:30 in London. I read every single one of those comments, and there is something genuinely wonderful about knowing that someone in a time zone I have never visited is letting this content keep them company. And if you have not subscribed yet, it takes 2 seconds, it costs absolutely nothing, and it makes a genuine difference for a channel like this. Go do it now. Then come back and settle in. Part 1. The Architecture of Cartman's Anti-Semitism. Kyle Broflovsky and the Jewish Kid Dynamic. Before we examine any specific episode, before we get into the language choices or the satirical structures or the reactions from institutions and advocacy groups, we need to spend real time with the relationship that sits at the center of the show's most sustained and most academically debated racial dynamic. It is not a relationship between countries or governments or ideologies or abstract forces. It is a 4th-grade friendship between 2 10-year-old boys that is also, depending on how you read it, a slow-motion ideological war conducted in the hallways of South Park Elementary and the snow-covered streets of their fictional Colorado town. Eric Cartman and Kyle Broflovsky. Cartman, the overweight, manipulative, explosively selfish, comprehensively wrong fat boy who serves as the vessel for the show's darkest and most unhinged impulses. Piley, the Jewish kid whose family moved from Denver, who has spent every season since the show began, trying to do the right thing and be a good person while Cartman makes that as difficult as humanly possible. The dynamic between them is one of the most analyzed relationships in the history of American animated television. And that analysis always comes back to the same central question. Is Cartman's anti-Semitism a tool of satire, or is it a source of harm? The show has always insisted it is the former. A significant and growing body of criticism has argued it is also the latter. Both positions contain truth, and sitting with both of them is more productive than picking one and ignoring the other. Matt Stone, who voices Kyle and who is himself Jewish, has said in multiple interviews and commentary tracks that the Cartman-Kyle dynamic was always intended to make the anti-Semitism look ridiculous. Cartman is wrong about everything. His bigotry is not a character quirk or a comedic exaggeration of a reasonable position. It is an extension of his general malfunction as a human being. He is wrong about history, wrong about science, wrong about his own intelligence, wrong about his own physical condition, wrong about what his friends actually think of him, wrong about virtually every practical and philosophical matter he has ever engaged with. His anti-Semitism is one item in a comprehensive catalog of wrongness that defines who he is. Every time Cartman expresses an anti-Semitic view, the show frames it as one more manifestation of the same brokenness that makes him feed a teenager his own parents in a bowl of chili. If you find yourself nodding along with Cartman's views about Jewish people, the show is suggesting, you might want to examine what else you have in common with a person who manipulates everyone around him, who cannot be trusted to tell the truth about anything, and who is ultimately driven by nothing more principled than the satisfaction of his own immediate desires. The association is the argument. But there is a tension in this defense that academic analysis has been pulling at for years, and it deserves more than a quick dismissal. The argument that the anti-Semitism functions as satire depends on the audience understanding that Cartman is the butt of his own jokes. And South Park has never been fully able to control how its audience receives that message. The show's visual style, deliberately childish and innocent-looking, assembled from what appears to be construction paper moved by invisible hands, creates a kind of cognitive cushion around difficult content. Things said through construction paper by a cartoon child register differently in the brain than the same things said in a more realistic context. The roughness of the animation, the simplicity of the faces, the way violence and language that would be deeply disturbing in live action are absorbed differently when they come from figures that look like they were made by kindergartners. All of this creates a distance that is sometimes useful for satire and sometimes just a way of lowering the audience's defenses. For viewers who were young when the show was at its early peak, the kids who were 8 or 10 in 1998 and 1999, who found the show partly because it was forbidden, who did not yet have the critical vocabulary to parse what satire actually is as a form, Cartman saying that Kyle owes him his Jew gold might not have landed as a takedown of anti-Semitism. It might have landed as permission, as a demonstration that this kind of language exists in the vocabulary of entertainment, that smart and funny people use it, that saying these things about Jewish people is a register of humor rather than a register of hatred. That is not what the show intended. But intention does not govern reception, and the gap between the two is where a great deal of the damage done by imperfectly received satire lives. A widely circulated post from the mid-2010s made this argument in blunt terms. South Park normalized anti-Semitism for a generation of young viewers and contributed to the cultural conditions that made far-right ideology more socially palatable. That is a serious charge, and it is one that the show's defenders contest with vigor, pointing to episode after episode in which Cartman's anti-Semitism is not only satirized, but explicitly linked to Nazism, to genocide, to the specific historical horror of the Holocaust, and presented not as a harmless quirk, but as the ideology of a person who, at his core, wishes to hurt people. The episode that crystallizes this tension most vividly, and that represents one of the most ambitious things the show has ever attempted in its treatment of Jewish identity, is The Passion of the Jew, which aired in Season 8 on March 31st, 2004. The context matters enormously here. Mel Gibson's film had just been released to massive commercial success and a surrounding storm of controversy about its depiction of Jewish people as the primary agents of Christ's death. The conversation about whether the film was anti-Semitic, whether Gibson's choice to tell this particular story this particular way was a religious statement or a vehicle for old and dangerous prejudice, This conversation was dominating American cultural life when Parker and Stone sat down to write this episode. Their response was to put that controversy directly inside the show's own anatomy, using Cartman's reaction to the film as a lens for examining what anti-Semitism actually does when it finds a culturally legitimate vehicle and rides it. The setup requires Kyle, who has been resistant to seeing the film, to finally watch it under pressure from Cartman. What happens to Kyle when he watches it is the episode's most disturbing and most important moment. He is briefly overwhelmed. The film's emotional power temporarily seduces him into believing that Cartman has been right all along about Jewish people bearing some kind of historical guilt. Callie, the show's moral center, the character we are most meant to trust, briefly believes the anti-Semitic narrative. This is not played for laughs, it is played as a moment of genuine psychological horror. The character we have been rooting for 8 seasons is temporarily captured by the most hateful logic the show contains. And the fact that it is Kyle who succumbs, rather than one of the show's less principled characters, is the episode's sharpest observation about how anti-Semitism works. It does not only operate on the already prejudiced, it can find purchase even in people who know better when it arrives dressed in the vocabulary of faith and suffering and cinematic beauty. Kyle's momentary surrender is a demonstration of the film's power to make bad ideas feel emotionally credible. Meanwhile, Cartman watches the film 34 times and uses it as a vehicle for something that was never really about the film at all. He organizes what he calls a fan club for the movie and leads South Park residents through the streets while shouting German phrases that translate to "it is time for revenge" and "we must exterminate the Jews." The residents, who think they are chanting in Aramaic and celebrating their Christianity, follow along happily, completely unaware of what they are actually saying. They have been mobilized in the service of genocide by a 10-year-old boy in a movie, and they will never know it happened. That image, ordinary well-meaning people enthusiastically chanting, calls for the extermination of a people because they believe themselves to be doing something holy, is as sharp a piece of satirical observation as South Park has ever produced. It is not funny in the way a fart joke is funny. It is the kind of funny that sits in your chest for a moment before you feel the other thing underneath it. The joke is not about Jewish people. The joke is about the mechanism by which ordinary human beings can be turned into a mob without ever being asked to consciously agree to the transformation. The mechanism is not political extremism. It is emotional manipulation, the exploitation of a film's effective power, the translation of grief and faith into something much darker. And Cartman, who is 10 years old and a monster, understands this mechanism perfectly and uses it with complete intentionality. The episode resolves with Kyle watching Gibson himself, depicted as a masochistic lunatic in Braveheart face paint, chasing the boys across Los Angeles in a tanker truck, smearing his own excrement on buildings while screaming in incomprehensible languages. Kyle arrives at the clarity that the film was never about truth or faith or the historical record. It was about one man's particular fascination with extreme physical suffering. Kyle returns to himself. The anti-Semitism is exposed as the ideology of the broken and the manipulative. Cartman is left with bird droppings on his face. The symmetry is aesthetically satisfying and politically clear. But the episode's satire also depends on the audience tracking the 22-minute argument carefully, following the logic through multiple layers of irony, maintaining the critical distance that the material is asking for. And not every viewer is equipped to do that. The Passion of the Jew is a great episode. It is also an episode that required Cartman to lead a crowd in Nazi chants, and that image, funny and horrible simultaneously, could be received very differently by different viewers. The Season 6 episode Jared Has AIDS from 2002 introduced one of the show's most persistent running Cartman gags. His insistence that Kyle is carrying Jew gold, playing on the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that Jewish people secretly hoard gold and wealth. The show layers the absurdity so aggressively, with Cartman explaining that all Jews carry fake bags of gold around their necks to protect the real bags of gold, that the self-parody is audible. But the underlying stereotype still has to exist for the joke to work. The fake gold has to have a referent before it can be fake. Later still, in Season 7, the show introduced a species of alien network executives in Cancelled called the Jewsians, who are depicted as small, greedy, obsessed with strip clubs, perpetually drunk, and running all of the media on Earth from behind the scenes. The episode presents this so aggressively that the allegory is impossible to miss as allegory. And Kyle's reaction to these creatures, a mix of horrified recognition and deep disgust, functions as the show's internal acknowledgement that it knows exactly what cultural territory it is in. But the self-awareness is doing a lot of heavy lifting, and viewers who came in without the context of the show's sustained satirical project might not have received it the way the show intended. What makes the Kyle Cartman dynamic survive across 28 seasons as something more than a repetitive engine for anti-Semitic shock humor is that Kyle is not passive or defeated. He is the show's most persistent moral voice, the character who most reliably calls out the various characters around him on their worst behavior, the one who knows that something is wrong even when everyone around him has lost perspective. Kyle pushes back. Kyle argues. Kyle delivers the speeches that the show uses to clarify what it actually thinks underneath all the provocations. He is Jewish, and he is the show's most unambiguous moral center. And that combination is itself an argument. The longest-running rebuttal the show has to offer against the caricature that Cartman is busy projecting. In the Season 26 premiere, Cupid Ye, which aired in February 2023, the show updated this dynamic for the Kanye West anti-Semitism controversy that had dominated the preceding year. Kanye West had spent much of late 2022 making a series of increasingly extreme anti-Semitic statements, claiming that Jewish people control Hollywood and have manipulated black people throughout American history. The backlash was swift and comprehensive. South Park's response was to give Cartman a cherub version of West called Cupid Ye, who floats over his shoulder and whispers anti-Semitic tropes into his ear, then deploys him to destroy the friendship between Kyle and Tolkien Black by spreading conspiracy theories about Kyle controlling Hollywood. The episode's thesis, delivered with more directness than most South Park conclusions manage, is that when black communities and Jewish communities are successfully pitted against each other, the only beneficiaries are the actual bigots watching from the sidelines. The framing of Cartman as a good Christian acting in everyone's best interest is the show connecting West's anti-Semitism to its long genealogy in Christian theology. And Cupid Ye even has Cartman's inner voice say outright that the Christian message and the Nazi message are the same message, which is a point more historically substantive than the show usually makes, and which arrives in the context of Cartman being so disturbed by this conclusion that even he has to pause. The show's relationship with Jewish identity goes further than these highlights suggest. Across minor jokes and running references and the texture of how the Broflovsky family operates as the only Jewish family in a Christian town. Kyle's discomfort with Christmas, his relationship to his faith, his specific vulnerability to a certain kind of social isolation, these things are handled with more care and more specificity across the full run of the show than the controversy episodes alone would suggest. Parker and Stone have never been fully apologetic about this complexity. Their position has always been that comedy, which protects any group from the full range of human scrutiny, is not operating honestly. Whether that position is brave or irresponsible is a judgment that has been rendered differently by different communities, and the disagreement has not been resolved in 28 years and is unlikely to be resolved before the show ends. What is clear, standing back from the full arc, is that the show has never treated anti-Semitism as acceptable behavior. It has used Cartman's anti-Semitism as a mirror, held up to reflect back the ugliness of the ideology and the people who hold it. The question of whether the mirror sometimes becomes the thing itself, whether the reflection of bigotry produces some of the same effects as the bigotry itself, is the one that critics have been most persistently pressing. And it is a question worth keeping in mind as we continue through the rest of what the show has done with race across all these years. Part 2. With apologies to Jesse Jackson, the N-word episode, what it said, and why it worked. There are episodes of South Park that are offensive and do not earn it, that take something genuinely harmful and use it carelessly, without the surrounding structure that would give the offense a purpose beyond generating a reaction. And then there are episodes that take something genuinely dangerous, something so charged that most television writers refuse to touch it at all, and build around it a satirical framework so carefully considered that the result ends up being commended by the very organizations that would be most expected to condemn it. With Apologies to Jesse Jackson, which premiered on March 7, 2007, as the first episode of the show's 11th season, is the second kind of episode. It is the one that used the N-word 43 times, uncensored, on basic cable television, and walked away with an official statement of praise from the NAACP, calling it a good example of educating the public on the power of hate words and their impact on individuals. To understand what the episode was doing and why it worked, you need to hold in mind the specific cultural moment it was responding to. In November 2006, comedian Michael Richards, famous to most of the world as Cosmo Kramer from Seinfeld, was performing a stand-up set at the Laugh Factory in Hollywood when he was heckled by a small group of black audience members. His response was to scream the N-word repeatedly and at volume, pointing directly at the people heckling him, in a meltdown captured on camera by an audience member, and circulated immediately across every media platform available at the time. The footage was devastating. The reaction was enormous and sustained. In the days that followed, Richards went on Jesse Jackson's radio program to apologize. And that apology generated its own secondary controversy. South Park's half-black staff writer Vernon Chatman watched the apology and found himself furious, not because the apology happened, but because of the specific theater of it. The implication of going to Jesse Jackson to apologize was that Jackson was the designated recipient of apologies for racial injury directed at Black Americans generally. That Jackson was, in some sense, the ambassador or emperor of Black forgiveness. Chapman's anger at this framing became the emotional engine that generated the episode's most important line. Parker and Stone had been wanting to build an episode around the N-word for years before the Richards incident. They had struggled to find a premise that would carry the weight of what they wanted to say without the content simply becoming a demonstration of the show's willingness to use offensive language for shock. The Richards incident was the context they had been looking for, a real moment in the culture that had already forced a public reckoning with the word's specific weight and the rituals Americans use to manage it. The episode's construction is worth dwelling on in detail because the craft of it is where its argument lives. Randy Marsh, the show's endlessly bumbling father figure, appears on Wheel of Fortune in the bonus round. He has been given the letters R, T, S, L, and E and has requested B, N, G, and O. The puzzle board reveals a word in the category People Who Annoy You. Randy, not fully processing the implications, reads what he sees on the board and announces it with the cheerful confidence of a man who is certain he is about to win a significant sum of money. The N-word. Uncensored. On television. The studio audience freezes. Randy's family experiences the specific terror of watching someone you love do something from which there is no recovery. The camera cuts to a test screen as though the broadcast itself needs a moment to process what just happened. And the episode begins its careful, devastating examination of what comes next. Not for the black people in the audience who heard the word, but for the white man who said it, and for all the white people around him who now have to manage their relationship to his having said it. Parker and Stone made a decision very early in the writing process. The word would not be bleeped. Every instance, every use, every reference throughout the episode would be fully audible and uncensored. This was not a decision made for shock value. It was the opposite of a shock decision. The entire premise of the episode is that the word carries a specific weight and history that affects people differently depending on their relationship to it. Bleeping it would have insulated the audience from feeling that weight. The discomfort of hearing it, unmediated and repeated, was not incidental to the episode's argument. It was the argument. If you watched the episode and felt uncomfortable 43 times, you were experiencing, in the smallest possible way, a fraction of what the word does to the people for whom it carries. Not just an uncomfortable sound, but a centuries-long accumulation of violence, exclusion, and dehumanization. What the episode does next is where its particular genius becomes visible. It splits its attention between Randy and Tolkien in ways that keep both threads running simultaneously, without letting either one become the show's total concern. Randy, facing the social consequences of his public use of the word, embarks on a sequence of increasingly absurd attempts to repair his standing. He goes to Jesse Jackson, depicted in the episode as a physically pompous political operator whose primary interest is his own positioning rather than actual racial justice, and performs a literal, graphic act of apology that involves kissing Jackson's backside as a photographer documents it. The resulting photograph runs in every newspaper. Jackson accepts the apology. Randy returns home expecting that the matter is resolved. Stan, his son, seeks out Tolkien with the same expectation. Randy apologized to Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson accepted. Everything should be fine. He approaches Tolkien with the breezy confidence of someone who has completed a bureaucratic process and is awaiting acknowledgement that the form has been stamped. And Tolkien, who is not consulted about whether the apology to Jackson had any bearing on his own experience, delivers the line that Chapman's anger had generated. Jesse Jackson is not the emperor of black people. And Stan, genuinely confused, replies, "He told my dad he was." The exchange is funny and then immediately devastating. On the surface, it is a joke about Randy's gullibility and Jackson's self-promotion. Underneath it is a precise critique of the way Americans have built institutions of public apology for racial injury that serve the reputations of the people apologizing far more effectively than they serve the actual healing of the people who were hurt. Randy's apology was not to the people in the Wheel of Fortune audience who heard the word. It was not to Tolkien or to any specific person his use of the word affected. It was to Jesse Jackson, because Jackson had positioned himself as the designated receiver of such apologies, and receiving that apology satisfied the ritual without doing anything about the actual wound. Stan's repeated attempts to get Tolkien to confirm that everything is fine, his insistence that Randy made a mistake, that he did not mean it, that the apology happened, that there is no reason for Tolkien to still be upset, are handled with a patience and a precision that is remarkable for this show. Stan is not malicious. He genuinely loves Tolkien. He just cannot understand why the ritual of apology did not resolve the emotional reality. He keeps expecting Tolkien's forgiveness to be something he can engineer, something he can achieve through the right sequence of actions and statements. And Tolkien, who is quieter about his anger than the episode's other characters, keeps declining to provide it on demand. The episode ends not with resolution, but with Stan arriving at an honest position for the first time. He tells Tolkien, "I don't know what it's like to be you. I never will. There is no apology asked for, no forgiveness offered." The conversation ends there, open and uncomfortable because the show is not interested in providing the comfort of a resolution that would not be true. Stan is not absolved. Tolkien does not say everything is fine. What happens instead is the smallest possible honest thing. Two people standing next to each other, one of whom has recognized the limit of what he can understand and is not trying to paper over it anymore. This is an extraordinary ending for South Park. The show typically resolves its episodes with some version of having learned something. With apologies to Jesse Jackson ends without the lesson being delivered. It ends with the limit of what Stan can understand being acknowledged rather than overcome. It is saying that there are things that cannot be resolved by good intentions, that empathy has a floor beneath which it cannot reach, and that the honest recognition of that floor is more valuable than a false performance of having gone further than is actually possible. The NAACP's praise for the episode was specific and substantive. They were not praising it for using the word, or for the performance of edginess, or for the controversy it generated. They were praising it for demonstrating, through the structure of its narrative, something true about the word's power and about the inadequacy of the rituals Americans use to manage it. That is a meaningful form of praise, and it came from the people most qualified to evaluate whether the material was doing what it claimed to be doing. The Parents Television Council's condemnation in the same week named it the worst cable content of the week. Their criticism focused on the language rather than the argument. The use of the word 43 times was, in their framing, the offensive act, regardless of context or purpose. The split in reactions was noted by multiple media commentators as an almost perfect illustration of the episode's argument. The people most affected by the word's historical weight understood what the show was doing with it. The people most accustomed to evaluating content from a position of not being targeted by it missed the point, or chose not to engage with it. The episode drew 2.8 million viewers on its premiere night. IGN awarded it a perfect 10 out of 10. The episode has been cited in academic analyses of South Park's treatment of race more frequently than almost any other, and it remains one of the clearest examples of the show using an offensive premise in service of a genuinely important argument. The episode also contains a subplot involving Cartman, who cannot stop laughing hysterically at the school's new sensitivity counselor, Dr. David Nelson, who has dwarfism. Cartman's uncontrollable laughter at Nelson's physical existence runs parallel to the main narrative about Randy and Tolkien, making the point that the discomfort of bigotry operates across multiple registers simultaneously. While the school and the town are working through the specific injury of a racial slur, Cartman is sitting in the same room expressing a completely different variety of contempt for a different person's existence, and no one can stop him, because no one has figured out how to stop Cartman from being what Cartman is. The world does not pause to address one form of bigotry before presenting the next one. The episode is honest about that. Part 3. Whale Whores Bikers. Japanese caricature, absurdism, and the Western gaze on other cultures. On October 28, 2009, the season 13 episode Whale Whores began with one of the most aggressive opening sequences the show had produced in years. The Marsh family is at a Denver aquarium celebrating Stan's 9th birthday, interacting joyfully with trained bottlenose dolphins. And then, without warning, without negotiation, the Japanese arrive. Armed with spears, they storm the dolphinarium and systematically slaughter every cetacean in the facility, while the birthday party watches in horror. The blood spreads through the water, the dolphins die. Stan's birthday is devastated. The Japanese leave. In the days and weeks that follow, the attacks continue. Aquariums across America, Six Flags, a live NFL game in Miami, where the Miami Dolphins football team, their name making them targets by the show's logic, are killed on the field during a kickoff. The Japanese Prime Minister, asked in a television interview whether all of Japan supports the killing, confirms that yes, all of Japan does. The episode is, on its face, a wildly offensive caricature of Japanese people. The characters speak in broken English, dress in what appears to be a conflation of historical and feudal Japanese aesthetics, carry spears, and scream various profane denouncements of whales and dolphins at operatic intensity. The exaggeration is so far past ordinary caricature that it resembles a fever dream about anti-Japanese racism rather than actual anti-Japanese racism, but only if you watch the full 22 minutes. Here is the critical context. Trey Parker is genuinely conversational in Japanese. He has been studying the language and culture for years, and his appreciation for Japan is deep and sincere. The Whale Whores caricature is not born from ignorance or contempt for the culture it is depicting. It is a deliberate and extreme deployment of stereotype as a vehicle for a satirical argument that has nothing to do with what Japanese people are actually like. The episode's plot moves through Stan's decision to join the Sea Shepherd Conservation Organization and its reality show Whale Wars, hosted by Paul Watson. What Stan finds is not the righteous pirate operation the television show presents, but a group of deeply ineffective performance activists who primarily use their show to document themselves failing to stop the whale killing. Watson is depicted as an obese, self-aggrandizing media creature who throws rancid butter at whaling ships and calls it environmental activism. His primary concern when something dramatic happens is whether the cameras are rolling to capture it. When Stan takes over the ship and employs more aggressive and more effective methods, the show's ratings soar because what Whale Wars actually needed was real conflict rather than performed conflict. The episode's satirical target is revealed most clearly in its second half. Stan confronts the Japanese emperor and prime minister to understand why Japan's relationship with cetaceans is what it is. And the answer the show provides is this. The United States government, at the end of World War II, showed Japan a doctored photograph of the Enola Gay with the aircraft being piloted by a dolphin and an American orca. Japan, believing this, has been prosecuting its revenge against dolphins and whales for decades. The conflict between Japan and cetaceans is built on a lie that the American government propagated for the purposes of winning the war. Stan resolves the crisis by showing the Emperor a new doctored photograph, this one with a cow and a chicken at the controls. The Emperor is furious. Japan redirects its lethal attention toward cows and chickens. Randy congratulates his son for making the Japanese normal, like us. Normal, like us. Two words that contain the entire argument of the episode. The thing that has made Japan's behavior seem aberrant in the American framing is not the killing. Americans kill cattle and poultry on an industrial scale, billions of animals per year, but the species being killed. Dolphins and whales are photogenic, intelligent, and sympathetic to Western audiences. Cows and chickens are not. Randy congratulates Stan for making the Japanese normal because the Japanese will now kill the same animals Americans kill. The only thing that has changed is the species. The scale of death has not decreased. The moral calculus has not improved. What has changed is the aesthetics. Japan will now participate in the familiar Western performance of acceptable killing rather than the unfamiliar performance that American audiences were reacting to with horror. This is a genuinely sophisticated point about cultural relativism and about the way Western animal rights activism is shaped by aesthetic preferences rather than by a consistent ethics of animal welfare. The show makes it through one of the most extreme and visually offensive caricatures of Japanese people it ever produced. The Japanese fan community's response was notably more positive than Western critics expected. Many Japanese viewers appreciated the subtext, the acknowledgement that the relationship between Japan and cetaceans is historically shaped rather than purely a matter of cultural preference, and the recognition that American criticism of Japanese whaling ignores American complicity in the atomic bombings that haunt that relationship. Paul Watson, the Sea Shepherd founder and Whale Wars host who was killed on screen in the episode, said he was not personally offended by his portrayal and was glad the show brought attention to the issue. Parker and Stone were reportedly annoyed by this because they had made the episode specifically to mock Watson's media-driven style of activism rather than to endorse his cause. The episode's satire of Watson was so effective that even Watson was able to co-opt it. Whale Whores represents a specific technique in South Park's racial humor, the extreme deployment of national caricature as the surface of an argument that is actually about something else entirely. The Japanese characters in this episode are not meant to represent what Japanese people are like. They are a vehicle for exploring why a particular practice seems monstrous to Americans when more comparable American practices do not. The stereotype is the delivery mechanism. The argument is the content. But the delivery mechanism circulates independently of the content. And an image of screaming Japanese characters in feudal clothing killing dolphins with spears can travel through the internet stripped of the 22 minutes that give it its satirical context. Part 4. Tolkien, and the most intimate racial self-critique. The show has produced. There is a character in South Park who has been present since the very first episode, who has never stayed dead, who has been one of the smartest and most consistently reasonable people in the entire fictional universe of the show, and whose name spent 24 seasons meaning one thing before the show declared, with a straight face and retroactively altered subtitles, that it had always meant something else entirely. For most of the show's run, he was called Token Black. In Season 25, Episode 2, The Big Fix, which aired on February 9th, 2022, the show revealed that his name is actually Tolkien Black, named after J.R.R. Tolkien by a father who loved The Lord of the Rings. And that everyone in South Park had always known this, except Stan Marsh and Randy Marsh. And, as the episode makes clear through a direct camera address from a physician who breaks the fourth wall, a significant number of people in the actual viewing audience. The construction of this revelation is one of the most intricate pieces of meta-commentary in a show built on meta-commentary. Start with the character's history. Tolkien Black has been in South Park since the pilot episode in 1997. His name was always understood, by the creators, by the production team, and by a substantial portion of the audience watching with closed captions, as a reference to tokenism, the practice of including a single member of a minority group in an otherwise homogeneous setting to create the appearance of diversity without its substance. The name Token Black is a joke about that practice. deployed on the show's only black child character in a mostly white town. It is a meta-joke the show is acknowledging through the name that it is doing the thing it is naming. For 24 seasons, this was the context in which the name was received, and then The Big Fix aired and declared that everyone who had understood it that way was wrong. His name has always been Tolkien. It was always after the author. The subtitles on every previous episode on streaming platforms were retroactively updated to reflect the new spelling. Tolkien instead of token, except in the dialogue of Stan and Randy, who are established as the people who had it wrong. The doctor who treats Stan for his anxiety about this revelation turns to the camera, points at the audience, and demands to know whether anyone else had really thought that a couple of black people had a child and named him Token. He makes clear that the people who assumed this were operating from a place of unconscious bias, that they accepted without questioning the idea that a black family would name their son after a social phenomenon, rather than after an author. The trap is elegant and uncomfortable to step into. Most people who have watched the show for any length of time did understand the name as a tokenism reference. The show's writers and producers knew they understood it that way. What the retcon does is shift responsibility. The joke was always about tokenism, yes. But if you simply accepted the joke at face value, if you never asked whether a real family would actually do this, if you never thought to interrogate the assumption embedded in the name, then you were participating in the very dynamic the name was critiquing without knowing it. You were treating a black character's existence as something to be explained in terms of social function, rather than individual identity. And now the show is pointing that out directly with a doctor breaking the fourth wall to tell you that you are the problem. The episode's main plot threads reinforce this argument through Randy's behavior toward Tolkien's father, Steve. Randy, prompted by a sudden awareness that he and Sharon have no black friends, invites the black family to dinner not out of genuine interest in them as people, but out of a need to feel like the kind of person who has diverse friendships. He then enlists Steve in his cannabis business, Tegrity Farms, and uses Steve's image and presence in his marketing without consent, treating Steve as a resource, as a brand enhancer, as a way of signaling things about the business's authenticity and social consciousness. When Steve realizes what is happening, he is not surprised. He is tired. He has had this done to him before, and he ends the business relationship with a clarity that Randy cannot match. Randy's response is to feel wronged. He reached out. He made the gesture. He took the initiative. In his understanding, Steve should be grateful. The gap between what Randy thinks he offered and what Steve actually experienced is the episode's central insight, that treating someone as a resource for your own self-improvement, even with good intentions, is a form of exploitation that does not become less exploitative because of the good intentions. Stan's arc mirrors this on a smaller scale. He spends the episode trying to educate himself about J.R.R. Tolkien and to perform his appreciation for black culture. And Tolkien's response to all of this effort is to ask to be left alone. Stan's education project is about Stan, not about Tolkien. And Tolkien has been carrying other people's needs for his whole life. The Big Fix is South Park turning its satirical machinery on itself with unusual directness. The show is not just commenting on the general phenomenon of performative allyship. It is acknowledging that its own 24-year treatment of its only black child character was itself a form of the thing it is now satirizing. Naming a black character, Token, and calling it a meta-joke about tokenism is still giving a black character a name that defines him in relation to his race and to white people's need for his presence. The retcon does not erase that history. It acknowledges it, makes it the subject of the joke, and assigns blame to the people who accepted the premise without questioning it. Tolkien as a character across the full run of the show has been handled with more care than this overview might suggest. From very early on, he is established as the wealthiest child in South Park. His family lives in the largest house in town. His father is a lawyer. His mother is a chemist. This choice is deliberate and meaningful. It places a black character in a show about a poor, white mountain town and makes him the richest person there, specifically to resist the assumption that race and class occupy the same social space in America. Tolkien is not the show's black kid. He is the show's richest kid who is also black. What that combination does to a person's social position in a small, overwhelmingly white community is something the show explores across multiple seasons. Tolkien is the most consistently moral character in the show's cast of children. He is patient, he is measured, he is rarely wrong. He is the character whose intelligence and decency the show uses to anchor the ethical arguments it wants to make. Whether that construction is respectful, or whether it flattens his complexity by making him a symbol of reasonableness rather than a full human being, is a genuine critique that has been made. But the show's willingness to make him the smartest and most reasonable person in the room, in a show that constantly surrounds intelligence with stupidity and reasonableness with chaos, is not a small thing. He was always worth more than his name suggested. The show eventually acknowledged that and pointed at the people who had missed it. Part 5. Here comes the neighborhood. Class, race, and what the residents of South Park cannot see about themselves. The Season 5 episode that aired on November 28, 2001 is titled Here Comes the Neighborhood, and the title is a play on the phrase, "There goes the neighborhood," the coded language used, historically and in more recent decades, when members of a majority white community discuss the arrival of black families in their area. The phrase is nominally about real estate values and community character. What it has actually meant, in American usage, is a racial anxiety dressed up as an economic concern. South Park's episode takes that phrase and its implicit meaning and runs them through a machine of deliberate inversion. In this version of events, Tolkien, who is the richest child in South Park, who lives in the largest house in town, whose family has more resources than any other family in the community, is the one who is being made uncomfortable. Not by other people's wealth, but by his own isolation. He is the only child in his school who has a DVD player, while everyone else is still watching VHS tapes. He is wealthy and alone in his wealth, and the teasing he receives for this is persistent enough that he takes action. He mails a payment for ad space in Forbes magazine, advertising South Park as the next Aspen. The response is a wave of rich celebrities choosing to relocate to South Park. And in the show's version of events, all of these celebrities are black. Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith, Oprah Winfrey, P. Diddy, Snoop Dogg, Kobe Bryant, Bill Cosby. The most famous wealthy black people in America in 2001, all choosing South Park because its ad in Forbes described it as beautiful mountain country. The white working-class residents of South Park are appalled. They do not describe their reaction in racial terms. They describe it in class terms. They call the newcomers richers and cash chuckers. They complain about the richers moving to their neighborhood, sending their kids to their schools, mixing with their pure, non-rich kids. Mr. Garrison leads the campaign against the newcomers, and the language he uses to describe his resentment is entirely economic. He is not racist. He just does not like rich people. The episode builds its parallel with terrible precision. The residents enforce a series of measures against the newcomers that map exactly onto the Jim Crow segregation laws of the American South. The rich people are forced to sit at the front of buses because the front is first class and therefore better, barred from certain restaurants and bars, excluded from community spaces. These are the same policies that were applied to black Americans in the South during segregation, but inverted, applied to wealthy black celebrities by poor white residents who insist they are not racist, they just have concerns about the richers. Shah, the show's other primary black character, a working-class man who is not wealthy, is approached by the newly arrived celebrities to join their millionaire march against the discrimination they are facing. They assume, because he is black, that he must be wealthy. He tries to explain that he is not. They offer him $100 to march with them, and he takes it. Chef is not wealthy. He is black. But to the wealthy black celebrities, being black and being wealthy seem naturally connected in a way that the show is quietly exposing as its own form of assumption. The episode's emotional core, beyond the satire, is Tolkien's experience of discovering that the wealthy kids who arrived in response to his advertisement are as alienating as the poor kids he was trying to escape. The rich kids play polo. They speak in affected English accents. They find snowball fights barbaric. They taunt Tolkien into going to live with lions in the South Park Zoo because he is too poor for their social world. He is too rich for the working-class kids and too poor for the wealthy ones. The isolation is not resolved by finding his people. There are no his people. Not in this town, not quite. The ending is the episode's most honest moment. The rich people are driven out by the residents' sustained campaign of hostility. Mr. Garrison triumphantly tells his neighbors that they can now get rich by selling the vacated houses. He is told that by doing this, they will become exactly what they hate. He shrugs. Well, yeah, but at least I got rid of all those damn And the credits roll. The word does not need to be completed. The episode has been building to its presence for 22 minutes, constructing the class-based vocabulary that replaced it throughout, demonstrating how completely the class resentment mapped onto racial imagery and logic, showing the residents performing every act of racial discrimination that has been documented in American history, while insisting they were only responding to economic concerns. And then Garrison's final syllable confirms what was always true. It was never about the money. Parker and Stone described this episode in commentary as depicting a world they imagined had no racism, where the only conflict was class-based, and then using Garrison's final word to demonstrate that even in that imagined world, the racism was still there, still structurally embedded on, still coming out in the moment when a white man thinks he has won. Part 6, Tuong Lu Kim and City Walk, 9 seasons of caricature, followed by the most elaborate satirical reveal in television history. For 9 seasons, from his debut in the season 6 episode Jared Has AIDS in 2002 through the season 15 episode City Sushi in 2011, Tuong Lu Kim operated as one of the show's most sustained and most divisive recurring characters. He was the owner of City Walk, the only Chinese restaurant in South Park. He was voiced by Trey Parker in a heavily exaggerated Chinese accent that converted the word city into something that rhymes with shitty. His eyes were rendered as thin, nearly closed slits. His posture was crooked. His relationship with Mongolians, who periodically appeared to tear down whatever walls he had most recently built, was one of the show's most reliably absurdist running gags. He was, on the surface, a caricature so extreme that it had no obvious satirical target. He appeared to be exactly what he appeared to be, a Chinese stereotype, deployed for laughs. 9 seasons is a long time to maintain a joke before its punchline arrives. But the punchline delivered in City Sushi was worth the wait. The episode revealed that Tuong Lu Kim is not Chinese. He has never been Chinese. His name, assembled from Vietnamese, Chinese, and Korean cultural sources, none of which are the same culture, was constructed not by a Chinese person, but by a white man who had only a vague sense of what Asian-sounding names should contain. His actual name is Dr. William Janus. He is a wealthy white psychiatrist who suffers from severe dissociative identity disorder. And his most fully formed, most dominant alternate personality, the one that has effectively taken over his daily life, is a Chinese restaurant owner. For 9 years, a white man had been convincing everyone in South Park that he was Chinese by squinting his eyes and speaking in a stereotypical accent. And the residents of South Park who had interacted with him for nearly a decade had never questioned it, had never looked closely enough to see the performance for what it was. The implications of this reveal are considerable and deliberate. The character of Tuong Lu Kim, now understood as a white man's construction of a Chinese identity, is a caricature not of Chinese people, but of the way white Americans caricature Chinese people. The broken English, the exaggerated accent, the stereotypical physical presentation, these are the ingredients of a performance assembled from cultural shorthand, the same shorthand that racist stereotypes always draw from. Dr. Janus's Chinese persona is what a white man imagines a Chinese person should look and sound like, assembled from a lifetime of exposure to American cultural stereotyping of Chinese people. The residents of South Park, who accepted the performance without question for 9 years, are implicated in the joke's structure. They were so accustomed to the cultural script, Chinese restaurant owner, certain accent, certain mannerisms, that they never thought to examine whether the person in front of them actually matched the script or was only performing it. Their acceptance of the performance reveals the extent to which they related to Tuong Lu Kim, not as a person, but as a collection of expected attributes, a placeholder into which they plugged a set of assumptions they had always carried without examining them. The City Sushi episode carries additional satirical content in its subplot involving a newly opened Japanese restaurant, City Sushi, which opens directly next door to City Walk. Lu Kim's response to this development is to plan the murder of the sushi restaurant's owner, Junichi Takayama, by luring him to the top of a tower and staging it as a suicide. When the police arrive and reveal to Lu Kim that he is not Chinese but white, Takayama is so ashamed of having been fooled by a white man's performance of Chineseness that he jumps from the tower himself. On the way down, he berates himself for being stereotypical. It is a death that comments on its own offensiveness. What the episode accomplishes through this accumulation of layers is a satirical critique of stereotype that required the stereotype's full deployment in order to work. The argument that racial caricature is a white construction, that what circulates as the Chinese person or the Japanese person in American comedy is not based on actual Chinese or Japanese people, but on white America's projection of what those people should look like and how they should speak. This is the episode's thesis, demonstrating that thesis required 9 seasons of Tuong Lu Kim existing as that construction, performing that caricature, being accepted without question. And then it required the reveal. The name Tuong Lu Kim is itself a layer of the argument. Tuong is Vietnamese, Lu is Chinese, Kim is Korean. These names are not from the same culture. No Chinese person would have this name. But a white man constructing a Chinese identity from vague Asian cultural reference, without the knowledge to distinguish between the various Asian cultures he was drawing on, would name his alternate persona exactly this way. The name is the first clue that the character was never a Chinese person, but always a white person's idea of one. The show maintained this detail across 9 years without drawing attention to it, making the reveal more complete. Part 7. Red Man's Greed and the Native American Casino episode, Historical Reversal as Satirical Method. The episode that aired on April 30th, 2003 in the 7th season was titled with a name that the official streaming documentation now renders in partially censored form, which is its own acknowledgement that the title contains a racial slur that the show now treats differently than it did when the episode was made. At the time, it ran without the asterisks. The episode's premise is its most brilliant element. The Three Feathers Indian Casino, located on a Native American reservation near South Park, has been profitable enough to allow its owners to purchase the entire town of South Park and the surrounding land. The residents have been bought out and are being given a deadline to vacate their homes so that the casino can demolish the town and build a superhighway connecting the reservation to Denver, increasing the casino's traffic and revenue. The residents of South Park are being forced from their homes. Their community is being cleared to make way for a commercial development that will benefit a corporation with no historical connection to the place. They are being displaced by people with more economic power who have decided that the land is more valuable as something else. They have no meaningful recourse. They have a deadline. The episode knows exactly what it is doing with this setup. Every element of the situation maps onto the Trail of Tears, onto the Indian Removal Act of 1830, onto the pattern of forced displacement that the United States government imposed on Native American communities across a century and a half of expansion. The structural experience is the same experience that the show's white characters have never had to process, as something that was done to people rather than just something that happened in history. Chief runs with premise, whose name is itself a joke about the episode's satirical premise wearing thin, is presented not as a victim or as a righteous claimant to historical justice, but as a businessman who wants to build a highway. He is greedy. He is efficient. He is willing to displace people to achieve his economic objectives. He is, in other words, doing exactly what the United States government did to his ancestors. And the show does not frame this as poetic justice or as moral vindication. It frames it as the continuation of a cycle rather than the resolution of one. The residents of South Park respond to their displacement with the language of injustice and community and the sanctity of home. They protest. They organize, they sing Pat Benatar, they stand in front of bulldozers. They are doing everything that the people they displaced did, and with the same combination of righteous anger and practical ineffectiveness. The symmetry is quiet and devastating. The episode's middle section involves a plan to raise the $300,000 needed to buy back the town through gambling at the casino itself, which is a beautiful irony, the instrument of dispossession being used as the instrument of rescue, but also an illustration of the magical thinking that drives people toward loss. The town's adults pool their resources, bet everything on a roulette number, and win. And then, before they can leave, they decide to bet all their winnings again. And they lose everything. Randy, on the drive home, cannot connect the behavior he is criticizing in the casino's owners to the behavior he has just performed himself. The episode's resolution involves swarzes, which the casino owners deploy against the townspeople by distributing infected blankets. The reference is unmistakable. British military officers distributed smallpox-infected blankets to Native American communities at Fort Pitt in 1763, a documented biological attack that the show is invoking directly. The contemporary version uses SARS rather than smallpox, which makes it dark comedy rather than straight horror. But the historical reference is there for anyone who knows the history. Stan finds the cure: Campbell's chicken noodle soup, Dayquil, and Sprite, the middle-class white remedy available from any gas station, and exchanges it for the town's property titles. The episode ends without Randy having learned anything, without any explicit statement of the irony that has been constructed for 22 minutes. The symmetry between what the casino owners did and what the residents of South Park have historically done is not something that gets resolved. It just is what it is, and that structural honestly is more truthful than any resolution would have been. Part 8. The show's treatment of black characters beyond Tolkien, chef, celebrity, and the Cupid Ye era. Tolkien Black is the show's primary black character and one of its most consistently moral voices across 28 seasons. But the show's treatment of black representation extends considerably beyond Tolkien and beyond any single episode, and looking at the accumulation of choices reveals a more complicated picture than either the show's defenders or its critics usually acknowledge. Chef, voiced by Isaac Hayes from the show's premiere in 1997 until his departure in 2006, was for most of the show's run the most mature and grounded adult in South Park. He was warm, he was wise, he was actually parental in the way that the show's white adults almost never were. He was, in other words, a character rather than a caricature, which was not nothing for a show that deployed caricature so freely everywhere else. His departure from the show was one of the most genuinely sad chapters in its history. Hayes suffered a stroke in January 2006. He was in no condition to make decisions about his career. The press release announcing his departure, citing the show's satire of Scientology as the reason for leaving, was issued by people in his inner circle who were themselves Scientologists. His son, Isaac Hayes III, confirmed years later that his father had not chosen to leave. He had been removed by proxy by people who were supposed to be protecting him. The episode that followed, The Return of Chef, used spliced audio of Hayes' voice to have the character brainwashed and then killed. It was a response misdirected at a man who had not actually chosen to leave, and that fact makes it among the most painful things the show has ever inadvertently done. The show's treatment of black public figures has been consistent with its treatment of everyone else. They are potential satirical targets regardless of race. Jesse Jackson, as discussed in the N-word episode section, is satirized as a politically self-serving figure who appointed himself ambassador of black forgiveness. Barack Obama's election in 2008 was handled in About Last Night, which is memorable primarily for showing the white characters in South Park so devastated by Obama's victory that they prepare for what they assume will be the apocalypse, while the black characters celebrate. The joke is about white anxiety rather than about Obama himself. The Tolkien retcon's implications extend through the show's full catalog, retroactively reframing 24 seasons of storytelling. Tolkien's father Steve appears across multiple seasons, and his combination of wealth, dignity, and patience has always been one of the show's implicit arguments against the racist assumption that black families in South Park need to be explained in terms of their race. Steve is a lawyer, Linda is a chemist. They live in a large house. They are the blacks, not the black family, and that distinction, maintained across the show's full run, with occasional slippage, is itself a position on how black characters should operate in fiction. The Cupid Ye episode from season 26 demonstrated that the show's treatment of black-Jewish dynamics had evolved considerably since the show's early seasons. The episode's argument that anti-Semitic conspiracy theories specifically target the alliance between black and Jewish communities, that the bigot's strategy is always to pit these communities against each other, is handled with more care and more historical substance than anything in the show's early treatment of these relationships. It is the show's racial comedy at its most mature, and it arrived in season 26, which suggests that the maturation has been real and not just apparent. Part 9. Equal Opportunity Offense, the Limits of Satirical Distance, and What the Show Actually Did to American Racial Discourse. The defense that Parker and Stone have offered for the show's racial humor since the beginning has been consistent. South Park is an equal opportunity offender. No group is protected. Everyone gets satirized with the same intensity. This is the show's philosophical position and its most effective shield against the specific accusation of targeting any particular community. The argument has merit. The show has satirized white people, working-class white culture, rural white America, wealthy white liberals, and white saviorism, with at least as much energy as it has applied to any other group. Randy Marsh, the show's most reliably humiliated adult, is a white man whose failures of judgment and self-awareness have been the engine of many of the show's best storylines. The residents of South Park as a collective are almost always wrong about almost everything, and they are almost all white. But the equal opportunity argument has been challenged by scholars and critics on grounds that deserve more than a dismissal. The argument is that treating all groups as equally worthy of mockery is not the same as treating all groups with equal impact. A joke about a group that holds social, economic, and political power lands differently than a joke about a group that has historically been oppressed and excluded. The two jokes do not carry equivalent weight in the culture. Satire that treats them as equivalent is taking a position, and that position happens to favor the groups already holding the most power. The man-bear-pig situation is the clearest historical case where this played out at scale. For 12 years, from the 2006 episode through the 2018 correction, the show presented climate change concern as the paranoia of a self-aggrandizing fool. That satire circulated in a political environment where climate denial was not just a personal opinion, but a policy position actively maintained by powerful industries and political actors. The satire gave that denial a comedic vocabulary that made it feel sophisticated rather than self-interested or dangerous. The show corrected course in 2018, brought the monster back as real, had the boys apologize to Gore. That correction was meaningful and unusual, but 12 years of preceding content had already entered the world. The same structural question applies to racial humor. The individual episodes are almost all defensible as satire with clear intentions. The sum of those individual episodes, watched by people at different stages of development and with different contextual resources for parsing satirical intent, may have had effects that the intentions cannot account for. Cartman has been loved by millions of children who were not old enough to understand what the show was doing with his anti-Semitism. The character is funny. The gap between his funniness and the horror of his worldview is part of what makes him a great satirical creation, but it is also what makes him dangerous for the viewer who catches only the funniness without the horror. What the show has done increasingly in its later seasons is turn its satirical machinery on its own history. The Tolkien retcon is the most dramatic example, but it is part of a pattern. The man-bear-pig correction, the Cupid Ye episode's direct take on anti-Semitism, the Big Fix episode's camera address about unconscious bias. These moments suggest a show that is not simply running the same joke for 28 years on inertia, but actually thinking about what the jokes have been doing and what they mean in context. Most long-running shows either double down on their original positions or quietly let the most problematic content sink below the surface without acknowledgement. South Park has, at key moments, said on air, in character, without excessive hand-wringing, "We were wrong about that," and then shown what being wrong meant and what the correction looked like. That is unusual and worth noting alongside everything else. Part 10. The Legacy. What South Park's racial humor tells us about comedy, power, and the limits of the satirical gaze. South Park premiered in August 1997. The people who were teenagers when the show began are now in their late 30s and 40s. They are parents. Many are in positions of cultural and professional influence. The world they helped shape was partly shaped by the comedy they watched when they were young, including this show. That influence is not measurable with precision, but it is real and it matters for any honest account of the show's legacy. The show's impact on American comedy culture is documented and substantial. Family Guy premiered in 1999. Adult Swim launched in 2001. The entire landscape of adult animated comedy that emerged in the years after South Park's debut was shaped by what South Park demonstrated was possible. That animation was not limited to children's entertainment, that adult audiences would seek out content that disturbed and challenged them. South Park opened a door, and many things walked through it. Some of those things were genuinely important. Chappelle's show, The Boondocks, Moral Oral, shows that used transgressive comedy in service of genuine social insight that pushed against the comfortable limits of what television comedy was allowed to address. These shows exist in a landscape that South Park helped create, and some of those things were less important. The equal opportunity offense philosophy extracted from the show and applied without the underlying seriousness that the best South Park episodes contain became a justification for comedy that was transgressive without being insightful, that reproduced the vocabulary of racism and bigotry on the grounds that nothing was sacred, without building the satirical context that would make that reproduction meaningful. The show demonstrated that being offensive could be commercially successful. It did not demonstrate that commercial success and offensiveness were, together, automatically the same as doing something worthwhile. The show's influence on internet culture is its own large subject. The ironic detachment that South Park helped popularize, the aesthetic of finding earnestness suspect, of positioning genuine concern about anything as naive, became one of the cultural substrates of online spaces in the 2000s and 2010s. The posture of finding all political positions equally risible, of treating anyone who cares passionately about anything as a dupe, migrated from South Park's specific satirical context into a general cultural mode that was not always deployed with the same intelligence or the same underlying engagement with the subjects being mocked. Parker acknowledged this shift in an interview during the Trump era when he described realizing that the show's instinct to mock both political extremes had been based on an assumption that both extremes were equivalent, that the threat of political correctness and the threat of a political movement built on rejection of verifiable truth were the same kind of threat. They were not. And recognizing that required the show to update its approach without abandoning its core commitment. That update is visible in the show's recent treatment of racial subjects. The Cupid Ye episode is more direct in its satire than most of the show's early anti-Semitism content. The Tolkien retcon is more explicitly self-critical than anything the show had done before. The Big Fix's treatment of performative allyship is more substantively engaged with the actual dynamics of race and power in America than most of the show's older racial comedy material. The show is still South Park, but it has been thinking about what its willingness produces, and it has been willing to say on air what it thinks when the thinking produces a correction. None of this resolves the fundamental tension. The show has made genuine contributions to American discourse about race, and it has caused genuine harm, and both of those things will be part of its legacy. The honest account of South Park's racial humor has to hold both. The show is not a safe text, it is not a reliable guide. It is not an authority on these subjects. It is a 28-year argument about what comedy can do and what it cannot, conducted in public, with increasing self-awareness about the limits of its own methods. The most enduring racial commentary the show has produced, across all of its episodes and all of its seasons, might actually be the one embedded in the Tolkien retcon. The revelation that a show could spend 24 seasons with a black character whose name was widely understood as a joke about tokenism, and then simply declare that everyone who understood it that way was wrong. That everyone had always known his name was Tolkien. That the racism was in the assumption. that the people who assumed were the punchline. The show rewrote its own history, changed the subtitles, kept the joke, and pointed directly at the camera. Closing thoughts. South Park's racial humor is not one thing. It never was. It is Cartman's anti-Semitism deployed to mock the anti-Semite. It is the N-word said 43 times uncensored to demonstrate the word's specific accumulated gravity and the inadequacy of the rituals Americans use to manage it. It is a Japanese caricature so extreme it becomes an argument about cultural relativism and the Western gaze on practices it cannot situate in historical context. It is a Native American casino used to reverse the direction of a historical displacement, performed by characters who cannot recognize what they are doing because they have never had to know the history from the inside. It is a Chinese restaurant owner who turns out to have been a white man performing a racist impression for 9 seasons. It is a black character whose name was always about J.R.R. Tolkien, and whose white friends never thought to ask. It is also, in some of those same moments, and in others, a show that deployed the tools of racial caricature faster and with more confidence than it could always control, that produced content whose worst interpretations were more accessible than its best ones, that gave some portion of its audience vocabulary for expressing prejudice rather than vocabulary for questioning it. Both of these things are true. They live together in the show's catalog across more than 338 episodes and 28 seasons. And there is no version of honestly engaging with South Park's racial humor that permits you to hold only one of them while excluding the other. For all of its failures and for all of its achievements, the show has been doing something that most television has not been willing to do. Treating race as a subject that can be engaged with directly, repeatedly, without apology, and with some of the consequences of that engagement visible in the work itself. The show has been wrong. It has acknowledged being wrong. It has been right in ways that mattered. It has produced some of the most pointed and useful commentary on how race operates in America that the medium of animation has ever generated. And it has done all of this inside the same 22-minute construction paper format, week after week, for nearly 3 decades. That is not nothing. Even when it is imperfect, even when it costs something, even when the joke does not land the way it was intended. 4 construction paper kids in a small Colorado mountain town, saying things nobody else will say, making the world uncomfortable in ways that are sometimes useful and sometimes harmful, and always, whatever else they are, honest about what they are doing. There is something worth sitting with in that. Something worth losing sleep over or falling asleep to, depending on how the night goes. If this kept you company tonight, thank you for being here. Please subscribe if you haven't. Leave a comment with your time and location. I read every single one. And get some rest. There will be more to talk about in the next one. Good night. Script written for 11 Labs voiceover generation. Natural speech rhythms throughout. No timestamps, no stage directions, no production notes in body text. All paragraphs designed for conversational delivery at a slow, deliberate pace consistent with North Park Channel ASMR format. Supplemental Section A. Immigration, Mexicans, and The Last of the Mohicans. South Park's treatment of Mexican immigration and Mexican-American identity represents one of the show's most sustained engagements with a subject that has remained politically charged across the entire span of the show's run. The show began airing in 1997, during the first significant national debate about immigration policy in the post-NAFTA era, and it has returned to the subject across multiple seasons and in multiple registers, from the absurdist to the surprisingly earnest. The season 15 episode, The Last of the Mohicans, which aired on October 19, 2011, is the most direct and most discussed of these engagements, and it is worth spending significant time with because the episode does something that South Park's racial humor rarely does. It makes a sympathetic argument on behalf of a marginalized group without undermining that argument through its own satirical moves. The episode is about a game of cops and Mexicans, a children's variant of cops and robbers, that the boys play in the neighborhood. Stan and Kyle end up as the Border Patrol agents, while Cartman leads the Mexicans. During the game, Butters, playing a Mexican named Montezuma II, becomes separated from his group and ends up genuinely crossing the border into Mexico, believing that the game has continued without him. What Butters discovers in Mexico is not the impoverished, dangerous place that American political discourse most often describes. He discovers a community, a warm, food-centered, family-oriented community that immediately accepts him, gives him a name, mantequilla, Spanish for butter, and makes him feel at home in a way that his own life in South Park rarely has. The extended sequence of Butters in Mexico is played entirely straight. There are no jokes at the expense of Mexican culture. The food is good. The people are kind. The community is functional and warm. The episode is making an argument about what it means to cross a border in search of belonging, and it is making it sympathetically. Meanwhile, back in America, real Mexican workers, inspired by what they hear about the legendary mantequilla, begin leaving their jobs and returning to Mexico. Cartman, who has been running an operation that depends on cheap Mexican labor, finds his workforce disappearing. The joke is at Cartman's expense, not at the expense of Mexican workers. They are making a rational choice based on what they actually want from their lives, and what they want is to be home, in a place that values them, rather than in America doing jobs that no one else wants to do under conditions that no one else would accept. The episode's satirical argument is clear, and it lands. The narrative of immigration that centers American economic need and frames Mexican workers as passive resources rather than as people with their own preferences and communities is the narrative that the episode dismantles. The workers are not coming to America because America is better. They are coming because economic conditions in Mexico have made it necessary, and when an alternative presents itself, in the form of Mantequilla's legendary community in Mexico, they return. America, in this telling, is a place they tolerate rather than a place they choose. Cartman, who has been treating Mexican labor as an economic resource to be managed, cannot understand this decision. His reaction to the departing workforce is entirely about his own inconvenience. The joke is on him, and it has always been on him when he fails to understand that people are not instruments of his desires. The episode is not the show's only engagement with Mexican identity and immigration. The recurring character of the taco vendor, various background characters, and multiple episodes that touch on immigration policy all contribute to a picture that is, taken in full, more generous to Mexican characters and Mexican-American experience than the show's treatment of some other groups. Whether this is because Parker and Stone are more personally familiar with Mexican-American culture from their Colorado background, or whether it reflects a specific satirical priority, or whether it simply happened this way across episodes written over years without a single guiding principle is difficult to say. What is worth noting is that the show has consistently treated immigration not as an abstract policy question, but as a human experience, and has done so with more consistent empathy for the people most directly affected by immigration policy than for the politicians and commentators who debate it from a distance. The people crossing borders in South Park are almost always shown as having reasons, as having homes and histories and preferences, as being something other than an undifferentiated mass of economic pressure on American wages and culture. That is not a revolutionary position, but it is a consistently maintained one across a show that has been less consistent on other racial subjects. Supplemental Section B. Canada, the British, and the show's treatment of white ethnicity. South Park's treatment of race and ethnicity is not limited to American minority groups. The show has a sustained tradition of lampooning specific white ethnic groups and nationalities that is worth examining alongside its treatment of non-white groups, both because it illuminates the show's overall approach to caricature, and because it complicates the argument that the show's racial humor primarily targets marginalized groups. The show's treatment of Canadians is its longest-running and most comprehensive national caricature. From Terrence and Phillip, the Canadian comedy duo introduced in the show's first season as the show within the show that South Park's children love and their parents hate, through Ike Broflovsky's Canadian origins, through the entire war with Canada in the 1999 movie, the show has maintained a specific and detailed comedic vision of Canada that includes the flapping head animation style, the frequent use of a boot as a phonetic representation of Canadian pronunciation, the obsession with craft dinner, and a general characterization of Canadians as affable but silly. The joke has been sustained so long and with such consistency that it has become its own running thread in the show's mythology. The reaction from Canadian audiences has generally been more amused than offended, which reflects something important about the specific power dynamics involved. Canada and the United States share a long history of being neighbors, trading partners, and military allies. The economic and political relationship between the two countries is one of near parity in most respects, and Canadians engaging with South Park's Canadian jokes from that position of relative security have generally been able to take them as the affectionate mockery between neighboring cultures that they largely are. The jokes do not carry the weight that similar jokes about other groups carry because the underlying power relationship does not carry that weight. The show's treatment of British characters, upper-class English accents, and British cultural institutions runs along similar lines. The Here Comes the Neighborhood episode's wealthy arriving celebrities adopt exaggerated English accents and play polo, using British cultural signals as shorthand for class position that is both higher and more ridiculous than the working-class white residents of South Park. The British accent in the show's vocabulary is a marker of absurd pretension, of snobbery that has lost touch with anything real. It is a caricature, but it is caricature aimed at people who have historically held global power rather than at people who have historically been subject to it. This distinction matters when evaluating the equal opportunity philosophy. The show's caricatures of Canadians, of the British, of various European nationalities are funny in ways that are relatively uncomplicated, because the groups being caricatured have the historical and social position to absorb the caricature without it activating the same cultural machinery that makes racial caricature of marginalized groups more damaging. The image of a Canadian with a flapping head does not connect to centuries of dehumanizing imagery used to justify violence and exclusion. The image of a Japanese person screaming with a spear does. This does not mean the show should not caricature Japanese people or that the whale horse episode is entirely unjustifiable. It means that evaluating these caricatures requires acknowledging the different contexts in which they land, rather than treating them all as equivalent moves in an equal opportunity game. The show has also engaged with various European and Scandinavian characters across its run, often through parody of specific cultural products or institutions. The handling of Danish characters in the episode that references the Muhammad cartoon controversy was intentionally neutral, acknowledging the gravity of what the Danish cartoonists faced without making them the comedic target. This restraint was itself a kind of commentary. A show that had no difficulty caricaturing almost anyone recognized that there were people whose situation called for a different kind of handling. The Italian characters, who appear most prominently in episodes dealing with the Catholic Church, are handled with the mixture of warmth and mockery that the show typically applies to white ethnic groups. The accent is broad, the gestures expansive, the emotional register operatic. It is caricature, but it is caricature that coexists with a more nuanced treatment of what the Catholic Church represents institutionally. The Italian characters are funny. The institution they represent is examined with a more critical eye. Supplemental Section C. South Park's racial comedy and academic analysis. What scholars have found. The academic literature on South Park's racial humor is more substantial than most people realize, and engaging with it provides a useful corrective to the binary of total defense and total condemnation that tends to dominate popular discussion of the show's racial content. Scholars in communication studies, media studies, and American cultural studies have approached the show's treatment of race from several directions. The most cited body of work comes from the Journal of Film and Video, where Matt Sienkiewicz and Nick Marks published an analysis in 2009 titled Beyond a Cutout World: Ethnic Humor and Discursive Integration in South Park. Their central argument is that South Park's ethnic humor does not simply reinforce stereotypes or simply subvert them, but operates in a discursive space between those two poles. A space where the meaning of any given joke is determined not by the joke itself, but by the larger context of the show's ongoing satirical project. The joke is not isolated. It is part of a conversation the show has been having with its audience for decades. This frame is useful because it explains why the same episode can be praised by the NAACP and condemned by the Parents Television Council. The episode is a fixed object. The interpretation of it is not. What determines the interpretation is the interpretive framework the viewer brings, which includes everything from their personal experience with the subject matter to their familiarity with the show's satirical history to their understanding of how satire operates as a mode. Viewers who bring rich interpretive frameworks to South Park tend to receive it the way the show intends. Viewers who bring thin interpretive frameworks, young viewers, viewers unfamiliar with the show's history, viewers who encounter individual episodes without context, may receive it in ways the show does not intend. This is not a problem unique to South Park. It is a structural feature of satire. Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, which argued in print that Irish children should be eaten to solve the Irish famine, was received by some contemporary readers as a sincere suggestion, rather than as the scalding, satirical argument it was. The more extreme the satirical position, the greater the risk that it will be received literally by readers without the interpretive resources to identify the satire. South Park operates in the same structural risk, at an industrial scale, for an audience that includes millions of people across every possible interpretive framework. What Sienkiewicz and Marx argue, and what subsequent scholars have built on, is that South Park's approach to this structural risk is not to moderate the satire or to include more explicit markers of satirical intent, but to create a show dense enough with satirical history and cross-reference that attentive viewers develop the interpretive resources to read even the show's most extreme content correctly. The show trains its audience over years of watching to receive its racial humor in the right spirit. The problem, as they acknowledge, is that this training process requires time and sustained engagement with the show, which means that viewers who encounter only individual episodes are not working with the full set of interpretive resources the show's ideal audience has. A more critical strand of academic analysis, represented in work like the 2016 Geopolitics article by Joe Thorogood, focuses on what the article calls the show's ambiguous role. Its capacity to be simultaneously progressive and racist, educational, and offensive. Thorogood argues that South Park's use of what he calls the body grotesque, the extreme, physically graphic humor that runs through the show, creates a kind of effective neutralization that can work against the satirical intentions. When something is deeply gross, when the body is being violated or exaggerated in ways that trigger visceral reactions, the cognitive processing that would allow the viewer to receive the satirical argument is partially overridden by the effective response. The joke lands in the body before it can be processed by the mind, and by the time the mind catches up, the moment has passed. This analysis helps explain why some of the show's most explicitly satirical racial content, the Passion of the Jews depiction of Cartman leading Nazi chants, for example, is also some of the content most vulnerable to being received in ways the show does not intend. The extreme content triggers a response before the satirical framing can do its work. There is also a substantial body of work examining the show's relationship with the South Park Republican concept, coined by writer Andrew Sullivan to describe young, socially liberal conservatives who appreciated the show's mockery of political correctness. Sullivan's framing, and the subsequent academic analysis of it, raises the question of whether the show's equal opportunity offensiveness actually served as a vehicle for a specific political ideology more than it acknowledged. The argument is that the show's sustained mockery of environmentalism, identity politics, and left progressive social movements, combined with its briefer and less sustained engagement with right-wing targets in its early seasons, created a net drift in the direction of what we would now call anti-woke politics, regardless of the show's stated position of absolute neutrality. Parker and Stone have pushed back on this reading, and their recent work, particularly the post-2015 content that engages more directly with the Trump era and its specific dangers, represents a genuine departure from the earlier pattern. But the academic critique has historical merit for the show's first 15 or so seasons, and acknowledging it is part of an honest account of what the show was and what it did. Supplemental Section D, what the show has said about racism in America, most directly. The Moments of Clarity, For all the time we have spent examining South Park's racial humor through the lens of individual episodes and character arcs, there is one more dimension worth exploring before we close. The moments when the show drops its satirical armor and makes an argument about American racism in the most direct way it knows how. These moments are scattered through the show's run, and they are not always in the episodes people remember as the racial episodes. They appear in dialogue, in the resolutions of storylines that began as comedic set pieces, in the quiet observations that characters like Kyle and Stan and Tolkien make in the margins of bigger plots. The most consistent of these observations across the show's run is the one embedded in how the show treats the gap between what people say about race and what they mean. Randy Marsh is the show's most reliable vehicle for this observation. Randy is a good person in his own estimation and in the estimation of his community. He is well-meaning. He wants to do the right thing. And his track record of inadvertently revealing the racism he carries without knowing he carries it, in With Apologies to Jesse Jackson, in The Big Fix, in dozens of smaller moments across the show's run, is the show's sustained argument that racism in America is not primarily located in people who think of themselves as racist. It is located in the gap between stated values and actual behavior, in the assumptions that operate beneath the level of conscious thought, in the social machinery that reproduces inequality, even when the individual participants are trying to be fair. This is a more uncomfortable observation than the one that locates racism in Cartman, who is obviously and comprehensively terrible and who can therefore be safely held at a distance. Cartman's racism is theatrical and extreme and easy to disavow. Randy's racism is the kind that is harder to identify and harder to address, because it does not look like racism to the person performing it. The show holds both of these up simultaneously across its full run, and the fact that both are in the same show. The theatrical bigotry of the character everyone knows is bad, and the everyday racism of the character everyone identifies with, is the most honest thing the show does about the subject. Kyle's arc over 28 seasons is the show's other most honest contribution to this subject. Kyle is Jewish and the show's moral center, and his experience across the show is of someone who keeps being the most reasonable person in a room full of unreasonable people, whose goodness is tested repeatedly without being broken, who maintains his dignity in the face of sustained and often aggressive disrespect. The fact that he is Jewish and that the show treats his Jewishness as an identity he inhabits honestly rather than as a quirk or a target is itself significant. He does not stop being Jewish when the jokes about being Jewish are not happening. He practices. He attends synagogue. He has a relationship with his faith that is complicated and personal and not reducible to the comedy. That texture, the sense that a character's identity exists fully and continuously rather than only when it is narratively convenient, is one of the things that separates the show's best treatment of racial and ethnic identity from its worst. The Tolkien retcon's deepest contribution to the show's racial legacy is the demonstration that even the most well-meaning engagement with race can be structured around assumptions that undermine the people being engaged with. Stan does not hate Tolkien. He has been Tolkien's friend for 24 seasons. He genuinely wants to understand his experience and honor his identity. And he has been calling his friend by the wrong name, built on a wrong assumption for the entire duration of their friendship, and never once thought to check. The show's argument is that this is not a story about malice. It is a story about the kind of racial assumption that operates beneath the level of malice, that persists even when conscious intentions are good, that can only be addressed by the uncomfortable work of actually paying attention to the people in front of you, rather than to the stories you already carry about who they are. That is the show's most mature contribution to American discourse about race. Not the provocations, not the extreme caricatures, not the controversial episodes that generated press releases and academic papers. The quiet observation, embedded in a joke about a name, that most of us have been looking at people without really seeing them, and that the first step toward doing better is being willing to acknowledge how much we have missed. Supplemental Section E, The Road Forward. South Park, Race, and the Next Generation of Viewers. South Park is still producing new episodes. Season 27, which premiered in July 2025, continued the show's engagement with current events at the same rapid pace that has characterized the production since Season 4. The new material, as discussed in earlier sections of the script, has engaged directly with the Trump era, with anti-Semitism as articulated through the Kanye West controversy, with performative allyship, and with the relationship between celebrity culture and racial politics. The show is not finished with these subjects. It may never be finished with them, because the subjects are never finished. For the next generation of viewers, the people who are now the age that the show's original audience was in 1998, the experience of South Park will be different from the experience of those earlier viewers in at least one important way. They have access to the full archive. Every episode that has ever aired is available, most of them immediately and without cost. The chronological development of the show's racial humor, the trajectory from the early Cartman Kyle anti-Semitism through the N-word episode, through the China ban, through the Tolkien retcon, is all available simultaneously. A 15-year-old watching the show in 2025 can watch The Big Fix and then immediately go back and watch every episode from Season 2, where Token Black appears, now knowing that his name was always Tolkien, now holding the retcon alongside the original context in a way that the show's original audience could not. This changes what the show means. The humor is different when you know the full arc of where it is going. The Cartman Kyle anti-Semitism land differently when you can see from the beginning that the show has spent 28 seasons building toward a more direct and more historically substantive engagement with anti-Semitism. The With Apologies to Jesse Jackson episode lands differently when you know that 15 years later, the show will retroactively declare that the show's only recurring black child character was named for a fantasy author all along. The archive is also a record of the show's failures. The content that has not aged well is there alongside the content that has. The audience that encountered South Park in its first decade, who had only the individual episodes as they aired without the ability to see the full arc of what the show was doing, received a different show than the audience that watches the full catalog in sequence in 2025. Some of what looked like moral ambiguity or deliberate neutrality in individual episodes looks, from the full archive perspective, like a show working through its own positions over decades. Some of what looked like equal opportunity comedy looks, in retrospect, like a specific political position being maintained through the device of equal opportunity framing. Neither of these reassessments is final. The show is still going. The full archive reading will continue to change as new episodes are added to it. And the audience that grows up with access to the full archive will continue to find things in it that neither the show's creators nor the show's earliest viewers could have anticipated finding. That is what it means for a cultural artifact to have lasted 28 years. It does not belong entirely to the people who made it or to the people who first received it. It accumulates meaning and interpretation and context as it moves through time, and the people who encounter it latest sometimes see things in it that were never intended, and sometimes see things that were always intended but could not be recognized until enough time had passed to make them visible. South Park's racial humor has always been trying to say something true about race in America. What it has been saying has changed as the show has changed and as the country has changed around it. The conversation is not over. The jokes are still landing. The questions are still open. And the construction paper kids are still standing in the snow, saying the things that most television will not say, in a small Colorado mountain town where it never stops being winter. End of additional supplemental content. Total script including all sections exceeds 20,000 words and is designed for 11 Labs voiceover generation, at a slow, deliberate, ASMR-compatible pace. The Weight of Cartman. What a cartoon villain tells us about real hatred. There is something worth sitting with longer than most people allow themselves to sit with it, which is the question of why Eric Cartman works. Not why he is funny, though that is a question worth exploring on its own, but why the character functions as a vehicle for the show's most extreme racial content in a way that actually illuminates something real about how racial hatred operates in American life, rather than simply reproducing it for shock value. Cartman's anti-Semitism is not the anti-Semitism of distance. He does not hate Jewish people as an abstraction. He hates Kyle Broflovsky specifically and continuously across 28 seasons of shared classroom time, shared adventures, shared lunches, and shared crises. Kiao is his best frenemy. The relationship between them, the gravitational pull of mutual dependence wrapped around a core of genuine contempt on Cartman's side and genuine exasperation on Kyle's, is the most psychologically coherent relationship in the show. And it is built on a foundation of Cartman directing the full vocabulary of anti-Semitism at someone he cannot stop spending time with. This is not incidental. This is the show's insight. The most persistent and structurally embedded forms of racial hatred in American life are not the hatred of strangers. They are the hatred that coexists with proximity, with familiarity, with daily contact. The neighbor who uses racial slurs about the family next door and then chats with them over the fence. The coworker who tells jokes at the expense of a colleague's ethnicity and considers that colleague a friend. The classmate who sees nothing contradictory about calling someone a slur and then asking to copy their homework. Cartman's relationship with Kyle is this dynamic, rendered in its most extreme and visible form, with none of the social lubrication that the real-world version usually uses to smooth over the contradiction. Kyle keeps engaging with Cartman despite knowing exactly who Cartman is. This is sometimes explained by the pragmatics of living in a small town where the social pool is limited. But it is also, across the show's run, a portrait of the experience of being a member of a targeted group who navigates daily life in a society that contains people who hate you and that requires, for functional purposes, that you engage with those people anyway. You do not get to choose your classmates. You do not always get to choose your coworkers. The social structures of everyday life require engagement across lines of hostility that the people on one side of those lines often do not even recognize as lines of hostility, because from their position, the hostility feels like normal banter. The show never lets Kyle pretend the hostility is not happening. He is not written as someone who has made peace with the situation or who has successfully reframed Cartman's behavior as something other than what it is. He knows. He is consistently, specifically, comprehensively aware of exactly what Cartman is doing. His awareness does not protect him from the harm. It does not make the harm less real. And it does not change the structural fact that Cartman is in his classroom and his social circle and his life. The show holds all of these things simultaneously without resolving them because they do not resolve in real life. The moment in the show's history that most clearly articulates what the Cartman-Kyle dynamic means comes not from any of the individually famous anti-Semitism episodes, but from a quieter observation that runs across dozens of episodes in the background. The fact that Cartman is almost always the person in any given situation who understands, with frightening precision, what the most vulnerable point of any target is. He is the person who knows where it will hurt most and aims there. He has this capacity not in spite of his hatred, but because of it. The intensity of his focus on who people are and their difference, their Jewishness, their blackness, their disability, their poverty, whatever makes them specifically vulnerable in a given social context, is the mechanism of his power. He pays more attention to these things than anyone else in the room, because his attention is organized around exploitation rather than care. And the show's uncomfortable observation, one it has been building toward since Cartman's character solidified in the early seasons, is that this kind of attention is not unique to him. The people in the real world who use racial difference as a weapon tend to be people who are intensely, specifically, exhaustively focused on racial difference. Not people who are indifferent to it, not people who don't see it, people who see it more completely and more consistently than most, and who have organized that seeing around cruelty rather than understanding. Cartman is the cartoon version of a very real psychology, and the show has been studying that psychology through the exaggerated lens of its most extreme character for nearly 3 decades. The function of Kenny, race, class, and who gets to be invisible. Kenny McCormick dies in almost every episode of the show's early seasons. He dies in graphic, often absurd ways, and then he comes back, and no one in the show remembers that he died, or they remember and immediately forget, or they acknowledge it and move on without processing it. The joke of Kenny's death and return was one of the show's most famous running gags in its early years. and it was eventually explained within the show's mythology as a consequence of his family's deal with the cult of Cthulhu. But the explanation came late, after years of the joke running without explanation. And the years of unexplained running are where the show's deeper point about Kenny lives. Kenny is from the wrong side of the tracks in South Park. His family is visibly impoverished in a way that the other main characters' families are not. His parents drink. His house is small and run down. His orange parka, which he wears in every episode so that it muffles his voice and makes him perpetually half obscured, is a piece of clothing that marks his economic status as clearly as any explicit statement could. He is the poor kid. The show has never let this be ambiguous. The joke of Kenny's death is, among other things, a joke about who gets to be noticed when they disappear. Kenny dies, and no one remembers. This is played for comedy. It is also a point. The people who disappear from social visibility without consequence, whose absence is noticed and then immediately forgotten, who can be killed and reborn and killed again without the world treating any individual death as a significant event, tend to be the people that the social structures around them have already defined as expendable. Kenny's deaths are funny because death should matter, and in his case it doesn't. And the gap between those two things, the gap between how much death should matter and how little this particular death matters, is the space where the dark comedy lives. The show has not always made this subtext explicit. But the character's design, the obscured face, the muffled voice, the perpetual orange that marks him as the poor kid in every frame, operates as a running commentary on economic invisibility that sits alongside the show's more direct engagements with racial invisibility. The two are related. In America, poverty and race are not separate variables. They are entangled in ways that have deep historical roots in slavery, in redlining, in the systematic exclusion of Black and brown Americans from the wealth-building mechanisms that were available to white Americans across the 20th century. The show does not always trace these connections explicitly, but the character of Kenny, sitting in the corner of the frame with his face obscured and his voice muffled and his deaths unremembered, is a portrait of who gets to be invisible in America and how that invisibility functions. When the show eventually gave Kenny extended storylines that explored his home life, his poverty, and his experience navigating a social world that had placed him at the bottom of its visible hierarchy, those storylines landed with a weight that the early death and return gags had been accumulating across years. The joke was never just a joke. It was a long, patient accumulation of evidence that some people's lives are treated as expendable by the social structures around them, and that this treatment is so naturalized that it can be rendered as comedy and still not be questioned by the people in the room. Tolkien's name and what it means, that it took 24 seasons. We have spent time earlier in this script on the Tolkien retcon, the moment in season 26 when South Park revealed that Tolkien Black's name had always been a reference to J.R.R. Tolkien, rather than to the concept of tokenism. It is worth returning to this moment from a different angle, because the thing the episode is doing with time is as interesting as what it is doing with naming. The episode aired in 2022. Tolkien Black was introduced in the show's 4th season in an episode called Cartman's Silly Hate Crime 2000, which aired in 2000. That is 22 years between the introduction of the character and the revelation of the correct interpretation of his name. For those 22 years, a significant portion of the show's audience had read the name as Token, as the one black kid who existed in South Park primarily to fulfill a diversity quota, whose name was itself a joke about his narrative function in the show. The show allowed this reading to stand. It did not correct it. It let the Token reading accumulate weight across decades of the character's existence. And then it corrected it, and put the correction in the mouth of Stan Marsh, who had been calling his friend by the wrong name for 22 years without knowing it. The correction came from Tolkien himself, who had been Tolkien the entire time. The character always knew his own name. The audience did not. The structure of this revelation is itself the argument. The character existed with his own complete identity, a name that referenced one of the great literary imaginations of the 20th century, a name that connected him to a tradition of world-building and mythology and storytelling, while the people around him, including the audience, had been reading him through a framework that reduced him to his function. Token. The black kid. The representation. The diversity inclusion. He was never Tolkien. He was always Tolkien. And the 22 years of the Tolkien reading are the show's documentation of how thoroughly a reductive framework can obscure the actual person inside it. Stan is not a bad person. He is Tolkien's friend. He has been Tolkien's friend for 22 seasons. He has gone on adventures with him and sat next to him in class and shared his lunch with him, and he has been calling him by the wrong name, built on a reductive assumption, the entire time. The show does not let Stan off the hook. He is horrified when he realizes his mistake. He scrambles to apologize, to correct it, to understand how this happened. And Tolkien's response is patient and weary in equal measure. Patient because he is a person of genuine character who has been practicing this patience for 22 seasons, and weary because the patience required is exhausting. And because having to explain to your friend that your name means something and that you are a person rather than a placeholder is a specific kind of tired that the people who have always been called by their right names rarely understand. The retcon is, in its way, the show's most honest statement about what it was doing with the character in those early seasons. The Tolkien reading was always the wrong reading, but it was the reading the show allowed. The correction acknowledges that allowing it was itself a kind of failure. Not a failure of malice, but a failure of the attention that a person deserves. The kind of attention that sees who they actually are rather than who it is convenient for them to be. Closing the loop. What 28 seasons of racial comedy means. We have been moving through a long history tonight, from the early Cartman-Kyle dynamic to the N-word episode, from the Japanese caricature in whale whores to the quiet dignity of Tolkien Black's name, from the satire of performative allyship to the self-examination embedded in the man-bear-pig correction. All of it adds up to something that is more complex and more considered than either the show's harshest critics or its most enthusiastic defenders tend to allow. The harshest critics have a point. South Park has said things that caused real harm. It has provided cover, at various moments, for people who wanted to believe that racism is primarily a joke rather than a structural reality. It has deployed caricatures of real racial groups in ways that were not always sufficiently anchored in satirical clarity to prevent those caricatures from functioning as straightforward mockery. It has been wrong on specific subjects in ways that its own creative principles would recognize as wrong if those principles were applied consistently. The most enthusiastic defenders also have a point. South Park has, at its best, done things that almost no other television show has been willing to do. It has made arguments about racism that required courage to make. It has told stories about racial identity with more honesty and more specificity than the mainstream of American television was capable of at the time those stories aired. It has refused to let its audience settle into comfortable positions about who the racists are and what racism looks like, insisting instead on the more uncomfortable portrait of racial prejudice as something that lives in everyone, in different registers and different intensities. And that operates most damagingly not in the theatrical hatred of the obvious villain, but in the structural assumptions of the person who considers themselves fair-minded. Both of these things are true at the same time about the same show, and the tension between them does not resolve. The show is not uniformly excellent on racial subjects. It is also not uniformly irresponsible. It is a 28-year project by two people who have genuine creative intelligence and significant blind spots, working in a medium and a culture that has its own blindnesses, responding to a world that keeps changing around them and requiring new responses. What makes it worth 28 seasons of audience attention, and worth this long and detailed examination, is not that it always gets it right. It is that it keeps trying. It corrects the Man-Bear-Pig episode 12 years after the fact. It renames Token Tolkien 22 years after introducing the character. It goes back and looks at what it has done with fresh eyes and finds things worth reconsidering, and then reconsiders them on screen for millions of people to see. That is not a small thing. The capacity for self-revision, for public acknowledgement of past error, for ongoing engagement with difficult subjects, even when the engagement is imperfect, is rare in long-running cultural institutions. South Park has demonstrated this capacity repeatedly, and the demonstrations matter even when the individual episodes fall short. The construction paper kids in the Colorado snow are still standing. They are older now in the show's mythology, wiser in some ways and still limited in others, still embedded in a social world that they are only partially able to understand. That partial understanding, and the show's willingness to dramatize it without resolving it, without offering the false comfort of a world where the racial complications have been sorted out and everyone is fine, is the show's most honest gift to the people who have been watching. It is a cold place, South Park. The snow never stops. The deaths keep happening and keep being forgotten. The names keep being misread. And in the middle of all of it, 4 kids keep showing up, saying the things that the adults around them are too polite or too afraid or too invested in their own self-image to say. And the conversation keeps going. That conversation is worth having. It has always been worth having. And if it takes a foul-mouthed construction paper cartoon to keep it going, well, that is not the worst thing that has ever happened to American public discourse about race.